Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you for attending the Fund for Investigative Journalism and Uproot Project's webinar on environmental coverage through a racial equity lens. The Fund for Investigative Journalism, or FIJ, provides grants and other support to independent journalists and news organizations to produce high quality, unbiased, nonpartisan investigative stories that have impact. The Uproot Project, and we are going to hear from two people from the steering committee. We're going to hear more about this project, but this is what I found on the website. Is a newly launched network for journalists of color who cover environmental issues, as well as students and others aspiring to cover this field. And I just really wanted to welcome my panelists. Before I introduce them, I want to say that I am so happy that FIJ and the Uproot Project is putting on this webinar. When the coronavirus first hit the US last year, the world closed down in March 2020, right? And we saw that the coronavirus itself was having an impact, a significant impact on communities of color. Minorities were getting infected at a higher rate, and minorities were also dying at a higher rate. And initially, people were pointing to their diet. It's because minorities eat bad, and then they talked about the health disparities, right? The obesity rate. They talk about, diabetes. And when in essence, one of the first things that we looked into when I did a Facebook Live, the first Facebook Live was with environmental justice change makers, people who said, look at the environment that many minority communities are in, where the air quality, right, is horrible, where they're in food deserts, where there are buildings and smoke. And so don't point the finger and say they're eating bad, right? So stop pointing on sort of behavior, right? So I'm glad that we can and it made people look at the environment just a little bit in a wider space, right? Say, wait a minute, where people live, how the government, yes, we know about redlining, right? Where people live, the places they are put into has an impact. Policy has an impact on health, on how long you live. I remember going to a webinar at USC Edinburgh, and he talked about how your zip code, is more important than your genetic code, because it can, in some terms, determine how long you live in terms of where you live. So with my spiel, I'm going to turn it over to the Uproot Project. I want to introduce our panelists first. We have Yvette Cabrera. She is the senior staff writer on environmental justice at Yvette. Is it Grist or Grice? Grist, and a member of the Uproot Project Steering Committee. She also serves as Vice President for Online at National Association of Hispanic Journalists and serves on the Board of Latino Journalists of California. Ms. Yvette is also a 2019 Mcgraw Fellow. Please go to grist.org to check out Yvette's latest work. Next, we have Manalo Sakara. Is she on screen and can wave to us? Hi, Manalo. She is the Indigenous Affairs reporter at Crosscut and also a member of the Uproot Project Steering Committee. Previously, she interned at Grist and Seattle Met Magazine, and her work has appeared in Scarleteen, Tacoma News Tribune, and other outlets. Please check out Manalo's work on crosscut.com. And now I'll introduce our FIJ fellows, Yanick Rice Lamb and Ese Olumhense. Yanick is a journalism professor at Howard University and co-founder of fearsforblackwomen.com. She's worked on the staff of the New York Times and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, among many others. And her work has been published in Essence Magazine, Parenting, Ebony, the History Channel magazine, and countless other outlets. I know for a fact because I used to write for her. And Ese is a senior editor and reporter for City Limits News and an adjunct professor at Columbia Journalism School. She has worked at the City, the Chicago Tribune, and the Investigative Fund. Ese has also been a freelance producer working on programs for MTV and Netflix. So first, I want to go to Yvette and Manalo. I'm going to start with you. Please tell us about the Uproot Project. What is it? Why was it created? Why is it needed?
Thank you, Lottie. We're so excited to be here to talk about the Uproot Project. Just for some background, how we came about was in the summer of 2019, Andrew Simon, Director of Content at GRIS, brought together a group of journalists of color who cover the environment in Seattle. And the goal was to talk about the challenges and obstacles that we face as journalists. And in the process of discussing these issues, we realized, number one, that we wanted to do something about it and that we needed to organize around it. And I was especially struck, I remember the first night that we had dinner together, we all went around the table introducing ourselves, what our beats were, and how we got into environmental coverage. And I was really struck by the fact that so many of us had come to these beats by accident. And by that, I mean, we were covering other issues. Like myself, I was covering criminal justice, juvenile justice issues specifically. I was doing a lot on immigration, work in immigrant communities. And it naturally led me to cover the environment as I asked questions around, if we're talking about the environment that impacts, especially youth of color, in terms of high police presence, over prosecution, poverty, educational obstacles. You cannot look at those environmental issues without looking at the underlying environment, the actual environment, not just the built environment, but the ecological environment in which they're growing up. And that's what led me down this road to look at issues around pollution and contamination in these neighborhoods where I was already working. And so, so as we discussed this, we realized we would like to create a robust pipeline, one that not only supports the existing journalists of color who cover the environment, but also to encourage young journalists in college who would like to seek careers covering the environmental beat. Also, journalists in newsrooms right now who perhaps would like to cover it, but don't have the tools to make that transition onto this beat. We know that there are a lot of challenges, especially at the community college level, in terms of the type of support students get, the type of training, especially data training, training on how to cover stories around science. So all of that is something that we felt was important to address. And so last month in March, on the first day of spring, after working a year and a half together, this was the original group that met, continued to work throughout the past year and a half to create the structure for the network. We set out the mission statement, and we launched on the first day of spring with the idea that this network is going to be member led, and so there's still a lot of work to do. We plan to set up what type of structure, but the idea is to try to provide training, webinars, all kinds of support for our members. And I'm going to pass it along to Manola, who's going to describe a little bit about what we hope to do this year in terms of that type of support that we give our members.
Great.
Yeah, exactly. And just like Yvette was saying, I think a lot of it just comes down to people not really knowing where to start. I think a lot of people are already doing a lot of environmental coverage, even, right now in my Indigenous Affairs beat, it's not specifically an environmental justice beat or environmental or scientific beat, but I'm doing environmental stories very naturally because it just intersects so easily. So I think making journalists realize the work that they're already doing is one step, and then giving them the resources to, go even further into that is the next. So yeah, what we're working on right now is creating some workshops that, like Yvette was said, will help people with the data part, the navigating the science part of it, some of the nitty gritty. But we're also working to make some connections between journalists and just create kind of more of a community there. So we already have a Slack, and we can, that's public. So we're trying to send that link out to everybody. So hoping to make some connections there. We have some social media right now where we're retweeting, grants and stuff like that, where people can apply to and get, financial support. But yeah, that's just kind of the beginning right now. Since we're still in our early stages, we're working on getting those workshops out, but hoping that in the next year we'll have some more concrete things like that. And then aside from that, we've also had so far monthly events where, again, people can meet other journalists, and we typically discuss environmental journalism aspects of that, and kind of give advice in the way that we're doing right now. So yeah, hoping to just kind of be ramping that up this coming year, but yeah, definitely needed. So thanks.
So you said you had an open Slack. Do you want to type it in the chat? And those who are joining us, if they are interested in joining your Slack, are they able to? If they are, students, journalists, are they able to?
Manola, maybe we can include, so there is a process to connect with Uproot. On our website, we have a survey that anyone who wants to get involved fills out to become a member.
Okay.
And that survey, we ask questions around what are your needs? What would you like from Uproot? We're using that not only to, one, connect people to the Slack channel, but also to determine what our priorities are going to be this next year and in the coming years. And so right now we have a steering committee, that founded the Uproot Project, but we want to add members to the steering committee. We want to create subcommittees to tackle all of these goals. And then, we want to make sure that that, like we said, what are your needs as a journalist of color in this space, and how can we address it? And so those are the discussions we that we're going to encourage in the coming months, so that we can narrow down what to focus on this year, next year, et cetera.
Yeah, and I just put the link for our website in the chat. So if anyone wants to click on that and go through the form there, they totally can.
Great, thank you for adding that link. Before I go to our FIJ fellows, Yanick and Ese, I want to ask both Manolo and Yvette about some of the projects or the recent story that you've worked on. What comes to mind with environmental injustice, you could say, is the Flint lead water crisis, which people initially ignored the community because it was a community of color, and they said, hey, something is really happening here. And now all of this is coming up where the city and public officials are being held accountable for this lead. But Yvette, like you said, lead can lead to behavioral problems, and lead can lead to other social issues, right? In terms of criminal justice issues, in terms of health disparities, in terms of education issues, in terms of how you perform in the classroom, right? Because you're living in a space that is not safe, and you're drinking water because the pipes are lead. That could lead to all kind of issues and could lead to all kind of beats. So I think Manalo mentioned the intersectionality of this beat of environmental justice, not just in terms of where you live, but in terms of the outcomes, the education outcomes, the behavior outcomes that may or may not lead to criminal justice, the health outcomes. I'm ready for Yanick to talk about her story in terms of people getting cancer. Her hometown of Akron, Ohio. Yanick, tell us about your story. You did a story about the toxic legacy of the rubber industry in Akron, Ohio. So tell us why you chose to investigate this topic and how it came to be.
I think this topic kind of chose me. My stepfather, all my uncles, a lot of my friends' fathers, a lot of the men in my neighborhoods growing up worked at the rubber factories. And my stepfather worked at Goodyear, and he died of cancer when he was 42. I was in the 9th grade. So that was always in the back of my head. And I didn't really, I think once I moved away, some people started saying, you go to a lot of funerals, or you know a lot of people with cancer. And I didn't think about that. And then also just little things like the snow. I thought it was normal for snow to have black flecks on it eventually. And I didn't really notice it was different until I moved out of Akron. And my sister and I sat down and we put a list of all the people we knew who had cancer and autoimmune conditions and respiratory problems. And we filled up several pages. And my sister's a nurse, my mother was a nurse, so I've always been interested in health issues and have written about health and edited a lot of stories on health. So I started looking into it a lot more. I was able to interest news outlets in covering it. I had trouble finding a grant initially. And then as time went on, part of the reason was when I would mention like MS clusters, because some of the people were concerned about multiple sclerosis. And that was another thing that popped up too, because one of my siblings has multiple sclerosis, and I was just hearing about, different unusual autoimmune conditions like ankylosing spondylitis, which I had never heard of before, and just, hearing different things over and over again. And the common denominator was that we lived in Akron, and in some cases, people were related to someone who worked in the rubber industry, a parent, generally. And when I started looking into it, I started finding some research that actually had been done in some of the factories, but some of it was old. And a lot of times people don't think about it because of deindustrialization, and a lot of the plants have closed. There's still some tires being made in Akron, but a lot of the production of passenger tires stopped a long time ago. So they primarily make racing tires. But even though some of the industry is gone, the effects still linger and are still affecting people, particularly in the offspring. So people have multiple conditions. They may have several different autoimmune conditions and several different respiratory problems, and then they might have cancer on top of that. So when I started looking into it, then I wanted to answer questions for myself, but answer questions that a lot of people in the community had also. So I think that a lot of times, like looking in your own backyard at what's going on there, and then also, taking that down to look at the people, and also looking at, what some of you have said too, at all the different layers, because, politics comes into play. You have to pay attention to the science. You have to kind of follow the money. You have to look at some of the agendas of different stakeholders at every level and putting those pieces together. So I always also encourage people not to be afraid of those stories, because they can get kind of tangled. Particularly when I started looking at a local Superfund site, just sorting through all these EPA documents and other documents and a lot of correspondence and a lot of back and forth things, trying to figure out, reconstruct the trail and to see what happened when, because a lot of things changed in terms of what initial plans were, and then possibly influence of corporate influences changing things, and governmental influences, and how that affects a community, and how that affects people who live in the area. So I also kind of attended a lot of workshops along the way, and part of that I was doing already as a health journalist, to kind of deepen my knowledge of cancer and deepen my understanding of different illnesses and how they work. So, even just like kind of understanding some of the finer points of cancer, because, just like with lung cancer or smoking or something, not everybody's going to get it. So trying to make sure you're explaining that properly, and looking at why it may or may not be connected, and understanding some of the chemicals involved and the interaction of the chemicals, because there's this, there's all this inorganic and organic substances that are used in different industries at different times, and then understanding the laws related to it too. So one thing shifted because of like the introduction of the EPA or the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act, and all these different laws and how they work and how they don't work too. So there's a lot of different levels, but it helps in telling the story, but always going back to the people. I think that you have to really focus on those stories and then go from there.
So I want to, and Yvette and Manala, let me tell you, I forgot to go back to you about the stories that you're working on. But Yanick, you brought up a really good point in terms of the players when it comes to policy, or when it comes to where you're going to build a certain plant. On one hand, people can say, well, we're going to give jobs to this community, right? And we're going to put this plant in this community, and we are going, and so it's a way for people to take care of their families, right? These are good jobs. And right off the bat, you really don't think about the health risk associated with working in a rubber plant, right? You think, wow, I'm going to have enough money to support my family, to put my kids through college. You're not thinking about, wait a minute, I might not be here to see my children graduate, because that doesn't come into play initially. And I'm not sure if you found that some things, maybe the health risks are maybe not told to people, right? Or when they are putting these plants up in certain neighborhoods and guaranteeing jobs for a neighborhood that may have not have had, jobs in a long time. And so people are eager to work. People want employment, as I said, but the health risks are covered up in some cases. I don't know if that was the case in terms of the rubber plants in Ohio, but it is a way for people to say, look, I want to take care of my family. I see this as a good job to take care of my family, and the health risks are not given to people.
Well, that's true. That's one of the reasons why in part of the phrase unintended consequences was used in the headline, because someone literally said that. There's a debate, there's a lot of nostalgia for the rubber factories, because we grew up going to, getting toys and candy at Christmas and all the different, picnics and the things they did in the community and things like that. But there were good jobs. A lot of people put their children through college, traded up their homes, traded in cars every few years, that kind of thing. But a lot of times they were not told about the risks of the chemicals early on and what it was doing to them. And until some policies were enacted, sometimes it didn't really result in union pressure and pressure from workers and things like that. Sometimes that didn't result in changes until, say, the 70s. But by that time, if you figure that some of these companies were started in the 1800s, so you have like damage of the cemeteries of centuries and, of a century. And then looking at, there was a geologist I spoke to who does core samples on some of the lakes and rivers in the area. And he was saying how you can trace a community's history through the sediment, because you can see how it was like there were more chemicals and heavy metals and things like that when industry was higher, or when more people were moving into the area, and then it would get cleaner as time went on. So there was one study I saw too that was saying that a lot of times people think that, you're getting all these jobs when factories move in, but they said that across the country, sometimes it only resulted in 500 jobs. And was that really worth it? But the other thing too is that in some cases, the industry is already there. So that was the case in Akron, because a lot of the companies moved there to be near the Ohio and Erie Canal. However, some of the neighborhoods around the community became Black and brown communities, or low income or working class communities. But at the same time, it's also not completely a race issue, because they also built some community neighborhoods for the workers. So there's a couple, there's like Goodyear Heights and Firestone Park, which are neighborhoods that had covenants, so African Americans couldn't really move in there, and some foreigners couldn't as much in the beginning. And some of those neighborhoods are still predominantly white, but because they were so close, they also had the same impact environmentally. But on the backside of some of the factories, that's where a lot of people were living. And in some cases, the house is right next to the plant. And even the house where I was, the house where when I was lived in when I was born, where my grandparents lived, I didn't realize it was much of a fence line community as it was until I looked at a Google map recently, because I knew it wasn't far from Firestone. But when you looked at the map, you could see that behind the trees, there was a railroad track, and then Firestone was right there. So it was like literally a block away from the house. And you know, my grandfather had cancer, and a lot of people in the neighborhood and things like that. So sometimes even if something isn't built there, it's the communities that develop around a plant or something too. And of course, one of the worst cases is Cancer Alley in Louisiana. You know, where there's a 100-mile stretch of different things too. And then also some of the stuff that's built on top of landfills, and people don't know that until it starts seeping from the earth and people start getting sick. And that happens a lot in our communities, or, you know, landfills that aren't remediated properly. So there's like things on and on and on.
I'm going to go to Ese, because Ese's project was about the coronavirus and the impact of the coronavirus in terms of the high death rates in Black and Latino communities in the Bronx. Ese, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Hey, so could you talk a little bit about what led you to this issue? Why did you want to do a story on this? This is very recent. At the beginning of our webinar, I talked about the impact that the coronavirus was having on minority communities in terms of us being infected at a higher rate and us dying at a higher rate. And so what led you personally to say, I want to write about this issue in terms of what's happening in the Bronx?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here and to be talking about this story. And the original story that our FIJ project came out of was a story that I wrote last September for the city about the impact of highways on the high rates of COVID mortality and morbidity that we were seeing in New York City, particularly in the Bronx, where I'm from. So similarly, you know, the previous speaker mentioned growing up in a community and seeing things and being exposed to things that, you know, initially they don't seem wrong to us or they don't seem strange to us. But then I think as we get older and wiser, we start seeing that some of these things, you know, have downstream and downwind impacts that we may not have considered before. But COVID-19 really kind of made this story more urgent. We've known about the high rates of asthma in the Bronx, particularly in the South Bronx, before the pandemic. But I think the, you know, parallel tracks of having a pandemic or a virus that attacks the respiratory system and then having poor air quality in a place and high rates of asthma, it's something that I couldn't ignore, particularly because I was also, you know, a kid with asthma growing up in the Bronx, you know, so long ago. So it was really a personal story. At the very beginning of the pandemic, you know, when the numbers started to get published on infection rates here in New York City, we saw that the Bronx had this very, very high death rate, despite the fact that of the 5 boroughs of New York City, it's only the 4th largest. So I was really concerned by what was happening to neighbors and friends of mine, and I wanted to write about it and take the story beyond, you know, some of the things that, you know, you mentioned earlier. Folks just aren't taking care of themselves, or folks don't care about their health and blah, blah, blah. And particularly with the air, it's very insidious to me because, you know, you may be able to choose what industry you work in. You may be able to choose what food you eat. You know, you may travel downtown to Lower Manhattan to get your groceries and come back uptown. But with the air that we breathe every day, with the water that we drink, we can't be as selective. There's no way that you can say, you know, I'm going to hold off on breathing the air in my community until I get to some place where the air is cleaner. Every day, and it's very invisible, it's all around us. Every day we're consuming this hazardous substance. And we saw, our story kind of really investigated this infrastructure of inequity. It looked at the Cross Bronx Expressway, which runs from east to west across the Bronx. It's part of I-95. Most people in the Bronx do not drive, so this is really a highway that kind of cuts through to take people to New Jersey or to Long Island. And we looked at the clusters of deaths, based on data that we crowdsourced through a project called Missing Them at the city, which aims to do an obituary of every single person in New York City who died from COVID-19. So once we looked at that data on a map, we were able to see these kind of clusters of deaths, and then follow up and investigate with the families who live nearby to see what kind of impact the highway had on them and how much more urgent that all was because of the pandemic.
So I don't know if FIJ is tweeting, but did you guys hear that tweet? She said, we can control what we eat, but we can't control the air we breathe. We can't control the water that we drink, right? Oh, that's a tweet. I have to say that Ese's project was also a podcast. So it was not only a print story, but it was also a podcast. Ese, tell us about what you learned from the families that were featured in your podcast. What did you learn just about the environment and how it impacted in terms of health disparities?
Yeah, I've never done, radio or anything podcast ever before. I've always been a print and digital journalist. So thank you, FIJ, for enabling us to turn our print story into something that's much more accessible for some folks in the community, and it's very intimate and very immersive. I'm going to toot my own horn and ask everyone to please check that out. It premiered last week for Earth Day. And something that I learned from the families that we spoke to, we really did follow up with the lead family from the print story. Asthma has such a deep impact in their lives, and you will be able to hear that if you listen to the episode. But for years, this family lived 2 blocks away from the expressway. So something that Yanick touched on a bit earlier that I think is worth underscoring. As a journalist, it's hard to do this with COVID, but it's important to see the thing that you are reporting on. If you're not from that community, or if you're not familiar with it, and even if you are in the way that I was, it's worth going there to see. You can see it on a map and it looks like one thing, but walking from the expressway to this family's home, being able to see just how close they were, it was like a few blocks really, being able to hear and smell and kind of consume what the people you're writing about consume on a regular basis. It's really critical. But what I learned from this family, we were able to kind of shadow them through visits with telehealth visits with a pulmonologist. One of the children in this family has very, very bad asthma. And it's really become something that the family is burdened by, much in the same way that my family, and you'll hear this on the episode as well, was affected by. And at first I was unsure of how to, I'm never the story as a reporter, but the parallels between the story of this family and seeing how much they've spent on asthma and all of the things that they keep to keep this boy healthy, and, the ways that they have planned and strategized everything, taking trips, vacations around this. It's amazing. And the producer or the host of Living Downstream, which is a program out of Northern California Public Media, who we worked with, they reached out to us to collaborate and adapt the print story for radio. They really wanted us to also talk about my personal story, my struggle with asthma as a child, because it really does illustrate the impact of the environment on asthma. So when I was a kid, just to give some brief backstory, I grew up in the Bronx, had really bad asthma. It was normal to see lots of kids being nebulized every day. Everyone had an inhaler. We all knew someone with asthma. We'd all seen someone else have an asthma attack and could recognize that. But when I was maybe like 8 or 9 years old, my parents moved out of New York City. Suddenly we had a yard. Suddenly we were breathing cleaner air on a regular basis. And I never had asthma symptoms again. after my parents moved. I never had an asthma attack till this day, and I'm hopeful it doesn't reemerge. Yeah. And as a kid, I think seeing that is so striking, right? Like the only thing that changed was where we were physically. And some of you may have read Michelle Obama's book that came out, I want to say 2 or 3 years ago, but there's a passage in there in which she talks about knowing that she had left the south side of Chicago because there were more trees. And I think it's painful, to be a kid and realize perhaps we're not able to articulate it in the ways that we can now, but to realize that where you live, the environment that you live in is hazardous to your health in a particular way, or is problematic for some reason or another. But I think that the podcast, The Eventual Story, is both an appreciation and understanding of what families go through with asthma and an explanation of how much this impacted me from my youth to my time as a reporter as an adult.
I want to go, Esther, can I just say you just had another tweetable moment? Are you guys tweeting? Are you guys tweeting? She says, where you live is hazardous to your health. But I want to talk about, Manala, you mentioned earlier about intersectionality, and that keeps, when Ese was talking about having asthma where she grew up, and then she moved away to where it was cleaner air. What immediately came to mind was income inequality, housing access to quality, affordable housing. People just think it's a housing issue, but it's a bigger issue, right? In terms of people have been fighting about minimum wage and raising the minimum wage. So now we're hitting, right, on other issues. We're hitting on, it's just not an environmental issue, right? It's an, income inequality, it's the wealth gap, it's housing and affordable housing. Yvette, am I onto something here? And so when I hear Ese talk about, just where she lived and she moved where there was cleaner air, you have all these other issues, as we said at the beginning of the program. This may be an environmental justice and climate beat, but so many other things are impacted by this beat about where you live. Health disparities, housing affordability, income inequality. And of course, before we go to questions, I do want Manalo to talk a little bit about that. And also mention your story, your latest story you worked on, because I missed that earlier. I forgot to come back to you. Yes.
Yeah. I think you're so right. And I think, just listen to Ese talking about this story, I just kept thinking about the fact that we don't really listen. I mean, all of this boils down to the fact that we don't listen to these communities. These communities have had these issues for so long, and yet the narratives that surround these issues still put the blame on them, or say that it's actually not about that, or always reframing. So often, with environmental justice stories, we're just having to push back against this other storytelling that's already happening. I mean, the same has gone, I've been focusing on tribes. The same has been with tribes. Tribes always have this narrative around them that they're mooching off of the government, that they're not self-sustaining. And a lot of tribes face that. Throughout the pandemic, they've been receiving, many tribes, federally recognized tribes, have been receiving shipments of the vaccines because of the relationship that they have with the federal government and the treaty rights that they have. They're owed these shipments of vaccines, and they're able to distribute them to their communities as they see fit. And a lot of people aren't well educated about that. So all they see is tribes receiving vaccines and distributing them sometimes differently than state guidelines. And a lot of tribes had received at least in Washington where I work, a lot of angry calls, people criticizing them, like, oh, you're getting all these free vaccines, you're not even listening to state laws. And again, just kind of circling back to that narrative of making these communities seem like the villains, when really it's the people that are not aware of the rights that tribes have and how they should be operating. And again, all these narratives that they've been fed all their lives about how tribes are not self-sustaining and how tribes mooch off of the government, et cetera. Anyways, with my reporting and a lot of other people who are reporting on Indigenous affairs, just having to like push back against that. Anyways, yeah, I think that with a lot of this reporting, a big key is being aware of the narratives that already exist around these communities. And then, like Ese said, like talking to the people in those communities, being physically there in person to hear the stories that the people there are telling, because oftentimes they know the truth and they've been trying to get it out for a really long time. And it's unfortunately sometimes as simple as someone just needing to listen to them and actually give them, you know, some respect to those stories and giving them credit for it, rather than trying to find a way that, you know, they're wrong, constantly wrong. Yeah, I don't know if Yvette wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah. Before Yvette, I just want to thank you for putting these resources in the chat. Yes, Yvette. Yeah.
Yes, in fact, it was thanks to an IRE boot camp that I was able to do several projects that that I'm going to mention. Definitely, yes, on the intersectionality of these issues, I've seen it play out in the investigations I've done on these environmental justice issues. It was actually an FIJ supported investigation that I was doing on young undocumented minors who were being referred by probation departments in California to immigration authorities that led me to this lead contamination story. When you were talking about Flint, Lottie, you know, I think that definitely speaks to these issues around how these obstacles in the community intersect. But essentially what happened was when I was working on that FIJ supported investigation, and I was interviewing mothers about their sons across Southern California, I kept hearing a recurring theme, which was that their sons had ADHD. They were dealing with hyperactivity, learning disabilities, inability to focus in school. And as I was finishing that project, I serendipitously came across a piece in Mother Jones talking about the impact of lead exposure on IQ levels, on learning disabilities, and on behavior, including violence. And so I thought, you know, that's really what made me step back and say, I'm not looking at the whole environment here. I need to look at the ecological environment. And so in the city, one of the cities where I focused that first project, I pulled up the data just to see if there was any existing data on exposure levels for kids to lead. And in fact, the city, this was the city of Santa Ana in Orange County here in California. The number of children who had high blood lead levels was much higher than all the other cities in the county. And of course, I wanted to know why. And I looked first at water, I looked at paint, and the water was not an issue in the city. The tests were coming out safe. And paint, although there was a likelihood that some of the older homes in the city were likely had lead in the paint, the percentage wasn't so high as to indicate, you know, why there were so many kids with lead in their blood. And so I settled on soil, and I couldn't find any answers as to why the soil might be an issue, because it just wasn't being investigated. And so I applied for grant money. I was a freelancer at the time, because I wanted to try to answer that question of, is there an issue with the soil? And this was before Flint, and I was coming up against a wall trying to get support for fellowship. And then Flint became a national issue that summer. This was the summer of 2015. And I was able, because of that sudden attention on these issues, I was able to get a grant to support that work. And I decided I was going to actually test the soil, and which was, I had never done this before, but I knew it had been done. And I started out by reaching out to a USA Today reporter who had tested the soil around lead smelters across the country. And she was very generous with her time, spent an hour with me on the phone, talked to me about how she did it. And every step along the way, it was about reaching out and asking for help. I reached out to the company that produces these. They're essentially, they're called XRF analyzers that test the soil. They loaned it to me so that I could do these tests because they understood it was a public service. I had a little bit of experience with Excel on that FIJ supported project on kids in the undocumented youth in the juvenile justice system, but I really needed more help to process the data that I was going to get from these tests, and so I applied for this boot camp that investigative reporters and editors offers, and they offer fellowships to journalists of color. So I spent a week in Missouri learning how to use Excel, and so that I was able to analyze the data. And what I did was I produced this 5-part series looking at how really the policies and regulations around lead exposure and specifically lead in the soil aren't stringent enough to protect our kids. And if you look at nationally, who the kids that were being affected by this, it was historically Black and brown children. And here in California, it was 80% of the kids being lead poisoned are Latino. And I was seeing that in the city of Santa Ana. And so I was looking at not just how this lead exposure was happening and sort of the discrepancies in the existing policies not being stringent enough, but I was looking at, well, what is then the long-term impact of this? And so if kids are acting out in class and they're being classified as problem kids and being funneled into continuation schools, being expelled, being suspended, instead of stepping back and saying, this might be an issue tied to lead exposure in the community, but we don't even know if this is an issue in the community. So I set about trying to explain in that series the impact on education, the impact on the juvenile justice system as well, because I did get data and I showed the map showing where the high lead levels were compared to the zip codes that had the highest number of kids that ended up in our juvenile halls. And there was an overlap between the two. And so it was about raising the questions around, are we protecting our children? Are we preventing this from happening in the first place? Because ultimately there is no justice for our children when they end up in a system that prosecutes them and puts them away for life, when at the front end we can prevent them from ever entering into the system if we prevent them from being exposed to lead. So I published that in 2017 for Think Progress, and now I'm working on a follow-up investigation looking at the potential sources and trying to answer the questions as to, because we all know this does not happen by accident. These are zoning decisions that lead to where these industries and freeways and railroads are located. And so I'm working on a follow-up project for GRIST, investigating the potential sources and the history of how all this happened in this particular city. And I would definitely encourage folks to, one of the fellowships that I got to support this current project is from the Mcgraw Fellowship, which is a business journalism fellowship, but they have expanded over the past few years to include environmental issues. And the director has told me, that typically the majority of the applicants that they get for these fellowships are white men, and they really, really want to increase the number of applicants from journalists of color and from women in particular. So there's an opportunity there for funding to support your projects, which, as we know, is really what you need, because these investigations take time, they take money, and that fellowship and grant support really does make a difference.
So Yvette, you also had a lot of tweetable moments right there. I'm just saying the way that you connected lead exposure in the soil, maybe playing at a park, right? Maybe playing a sport, soccer or baseball or football, just being a kid. And you connected that to classroom behavior, and you connected that to a juvenile justice system, right? And then you connected that, but when you're playing with the kid, you have no idea the policies that have been enacted, right? I want to call it what grown folks do. You have no idea the policies, like you said, that basically is sort of interplaying in your life. And you're just being a kid, but because of whatever, you're in a certain community for whatever reason, Like you said, it may be redlining, it may be zoning, like you mentioned, maybe zoning in terms of where they decide to put railroads, where they decide to put highways in terms of Ese's project, in terms of Yannick's project, in terms of where they decide to put a rubber plant in Akron, Ohio, right? Whereas is maybe zoning or redlining, that exactly, Ese's tweetable moment in terms of where you live can actually can be hazardous to your health. We only have about 10 minutes. And if anyone has a question, I'm going to ask that you please put it in the chat. And while I'm looking for questions in the chat, I'm going to ask Ese about tips and resources. First of all, thank you, Yanick, for all of the resources that you put in the chat. You put a lot of resources in the chat. And I want to thank both Yvette and Manalo for the resources and tips that you've given so far. The Mcgraw Fellowship. Yvette, you mentioned how you got training from IRE, data training, so you can make sense of what the types of data that you were finding. It's like, hey, I found this great information. What do I do with it? And you can get training for that. So I'm going to go to Ese and ask her about the type of tools or resources that she relied on or that she went to.
Yes. So I hope folks can hear me okay. I think that one of the major things that I would advise anyone to do is look for like-minded folks who are interested in the stories that you're interested in. I was lucky. I didn't originally find this partner, but I did get an email from the host of Living Downstream, Steve Mencher, who does this amazing podcast. It's in its second season. About, everything that we've been talking about today, environmental justice specifically. And I think, Yvette, everything that you're describing sounds like it would be a great fit for that show. And I hope that you two would be able to connect. But I think having partners that care about the work and being able to, adapt it for different formats is really important. Something else that I would recommend is I think in this moment, it's easy to be caught up with COVID or whatever the immediate crisis is. But I think remembering that these things are preventable tragedies and thinking about what the next kind of moment of crisis will be is an important skill for a journalist to have. So right now, I don't know how many of you listening today are familiar with multi-system inflammatory syndrome, which is what kids across the US were developing after being exposed to COVID-19. All of this data is emerging now on this condition, and we see now that Latino kids are more likely to have been diagnosed with MIS-C. It's like 38% or 40%, and then that's followed by Black children at about 33%. And the last time I checked, it was like white children. They were made up about 15% of the folks who developed this condition. But I think thinking, kind of ahead, we don't know how this is going to affect our kids. We know our kids are adversely affected by this thing now, but we don't know if it's going to stunt their growth, affect their organs in the future. What will the crisis be in 10 to 20 years? I mean, if part of this comes to, part of the skills I think that we need to have now are anticipating what's next and then talking to these communities about what's going on. Because with all of these issues, on our podcast, the host opens by saying all of these are preventable tragedies. Flint, what's going on in Ohio, what's going on in the Bronx, these are all, the downstream effects of what grown folks do, the policies that we come up with and create that may have hazardous impacts on our health. I think always of the William Faulkner quote, the past isn't dead, it isn't even past. So I think that history is being shaped by everything that's being done right now. And journalists would be wise to kind of anticipate what's next and connect with those communities in advance. Listen to what they've been saying so that we can avoid some of these preventable tragedies and do so and do reporting that is participatory. I think finding good grants, finding good, programs that would help you do things like Yvette mentioned, testing soil is really critical, or testing air. I wish it was something that we were able to do. Having skepticism of numbers that emerge, if the government in Flint, I know some journalists that would have kind of just printed all of the numbers that they got from officials. Oh, it's an official number, it's an official number. But I think it's incumbent on journalists now to be skeptical, but not perhaps cynical, but be skeptical of all those numbers and be willing to kind of do the investigative and like gut check work of like probing that. If they say that the, presence of, PM 2.5 in the air is this level, how can we prove or disprove that? How did they get that number? And what ways can we as citizens check that?
Great. We have a few questions. Thank you so much, Ese, for those tips. We have a few questions. I'm going to start with David Judson first. David asks, do you see, and this is to all the panelists, do you see any signs of convergence between the urban-focused environmental justice moment and the mainstream environmental movement classically focused on wildlife and ecological preservation? Anyone want to take that?
Yeah.
Yes, Yanick.
Yeah, I think there's more attention being paid to that. I know even just in the past week, particularly around Earth Day, I've heard people saying, you have to kind of go beyond the polar bears and the ice caps and things like that. Because, as we've been talking today, these affect real people. That's why earlier I was saying, tell the story of people. It's all important because it's all related to climate change and some of the things we're going through. But, when you're thinking about it being hotter and in the heat waves and elderly people being in apartments without air conditioning and death rates, that's all connected. So we have to look at all of those things and keep pushing to kind of broaden the topic and to push back against, because there's a lot of climate change deniers, as we know very well previously. But I think another important thing too, along those lines, is paying attention to like the Biden-Harris initiatives and stuff too. So what's working, what's going to work, what's not working, and knowing the history of those things as well too, because there's a lot of back and forth on different laws. Some laws are enacted, but they don't have any teeth in them. There's no enforcement in them.
Yeah.
Sometimes corporate interests, try to derail things, like some of the things we've seen happen with the EPA. And sometimes in presenting reports, it's kind of good to talk to a lot of experts, whether they're scientists or academic experts and people in the community and things like that, because sometimes people will write things a certain way. It's just like what you always hear about stats and facts. It's just like you can tell any story depending how you present them, but you want to tell the truth. You want to tell the right story and explain why they're saying it this way and why it really happened that way. So and that's what I was kind of finding, like when I was talking about the Superfund site. That piece hasn't run yet, but it was very tangled, trying to sort through all of that. And before I stop, I just wanted to piggyback on what Ese was saying too. So the FIJ grant, I think, is a really good one for people to apply to, because it's also broad. It's not topic specific. There are some topic specific ones, and I put some things in the chat, but there's a lot of support in terms of having a mentor who can work with you, and also having the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press kind of do a legal review of your piece. And I found that really invaluable. I worked a lot with Sarah Matthews there. So just all the different, resources available through the grants, and also networking with other people who are involved in it, and not being discouraged when you apply if you don't. Because it took me a while. Originally I was going to do it with the Plain Dealer, but the editor I was working with left. But the issue I had was getting the grant, not getting the editor, because sometimes there was pushback. And when Flint happened, I started putting that in my proposal, because this was our Flint, what's going on in Akron, that's our Flint. So, and I think just as awareness as time goes on and things like that. But so just don't be discouraged, just keep applying, keep pushing.
That's a great segue to the next question from Megan Parker, and I'm only going to answer the last two questions. She asks, how can we help close the application gap that Yvette mentioned? How can we better encourage and support women and people of color to apply for fellowships and grants? I think as someone who's on the board of FIJ, we also want to know this answer. How can we attract more candidates women and people of color to apply to our grants. You know, we have a diversity fellowship at FIJ, and I was a recipient of the diversity fellowship, and I was able to do a project that I'm extremely proud of. But Ingrid says just invite people to apply. Okay, I love
I
that,
invited her to apply for this one.
But I do know FIJ, we do personally, FIJ, I know we are at NABJ, and we do reach out to NAHJ, AAJA, and other journalism organizations of color. Do you have any more tips to answer Megan Parker's question?
I think all of us telling our stories helps a lot too, because I know I've been going to NABJ for years and a lot of other organizations. And sometimes you hear about these opportunities. I know other people have heard about these opportunities and they think, oh, that's a big thing to, you know, sometimes it's getting at some of the root things too, helping people tell investigative journalism stories or in-depth pieces. But you have to bite off the chunk that you can chew and don't be intimidated by the topic. That's why I was saying, don't be afraid to do these stories and find the people who can help you. Find the Ron Nixons of the world. He's at Associated Press now, but you know, people who are going to encourage you and help you understand a piece. He helped me crunch numbers on another story that I did before, you know, so talking to people who can, you know, help you with the science if you don't understand the science or whatever, untangle the politics or what does this really mean, you know, because sometimes, you know, other things come in. I got hit sideways with some radiation stuff, you know, that I had to deal with in terms of this story. So you just have to kind of like just keep pushing through it and tell those stories. If you start with the people and start, like I said, starting in your own backyard, because this was a, you know, story like Ese, I also have asthma. And so just looking at how do these things come about? You know, we're curious as journalists. So answering that how and the why.
I do. Can I add something here?
Yeah.
I think there's also an art to the application process for these fellowships and grants. And I've applied to so many of them. And every time I apply, I learn something new. And so what I've done in my newsrooms is I've organized fellowship presentations on sort of what I've learned from each one, because what works for one won't necessarily work for another. And so you have to research, you know, contact the director of the program that you're applying for, ask questions, ask other applicants what has worked for them. And so it can be, because it's such a competitive process, I can see how some applicants might get frustrated and give up after, you know, one or two tries. And I would definitely say be persistent, but also do that legwork. And I'm happy to help anyone, you know, because I have gone through this process many times and can give tips for particular fellowships, because one might require a one-page proposal that's a narrative versus an investigative proposal that's much more in depth, that requires that you have done, you know, half the reporting and have a hypothesis as to what you're, you know, pursuing or what what you may conclude as part of your investigation. And so, so each of those, you know, each process is different. And I think that type of support could help journalists of color, environmental journalists, you know, better hone their applications and have more success. And so I think those workshops at the conferences, like for NIH and NABJ, help, but also maybe webinars, you know, for those who can't make it to the conferences, to help as part of the appliation process.
Like doing a proposal webinar.
Pardon me?
No, I was saying like doing the proposal, like writing a proposal webinar. But yes.
Yeah, and sharing your proposals with other people too, because the people have shared theirs with me and I've shared mine with other people. But when I was saying, I just remembered when Yvette was talking that I applied for FIJ before and I didn't get it the first time around. So sometimes it's a matter of timing and competition, as she mentioned. So, and being persistent. So I applied again and I did get it later. I don't know exactly why, but I got it later. So, but also continuing to do the research and sometimes you can contact places and find out, you know, what you could have done differently or what you needed to emphasize. And when I found out that as I was talking to someone before and clusters seemed to be a barrier for this person, then I de-emphasized clusters in my proposal because sometimes people are like, oh, clusters are too hard to prove, which they are hard to prove, but since people think they exist, I wanted to be able to explain it. But so I just de-emphasize that and then like I said, I emphasize Flint later a little bit, or put a line in there about it, in that, people connected to that.
So I'm going to ask, I know we were supposed to end like maybe 6 minutes ago, but I want to get to this last question. Before I get to this last question, did you guys hear Yvette say that she was going to help you guys with your proposals? So don't be surprised, Yvette, if you get a lot of emails of people reaching out to you.
I'll put my email in the chat.
She's going to put her email in the chat, but she did say that, if you want to apply for a grant, that, she could probably help you navigate the system. So this very last question I want to get to before we have to head off. Thank you to my awesome panel today. Great work. Thank you for talking about your stories. So this question is, I'm an Asian college student who's planning for a long-term career in environmental journalism. It appears that reporters focusing on issues of power imbalance are at risk of gaslighting and even threats to their personal safety, especially when we are not white men. What is your advice? What are some advice you can give based on your personal experience? And how can we prepare early career folks like myself without turning or scaring us away from the craft? Manola, you want to try to take a crack at that?
I think that we kind of touched on this at the beginning, but I think one thing that we can do, especially for younger journalists can seek out, and hopefully we can keep providing resources, is just workshops that kind of get to the nitty-gritty of environmental reporting when it comes to data reporting, investigating things a little bit further, and just really educating yourself about the systems that you're reporting on. Because I think a lot of it comes down to just being confident in your knowledge and going in well prepared. And yeah, so I think that's a good start, just getting access to those resources that are helping you prepare yourself ahead of time. Does anyone else have something to add to that?
Yeah, I'll add, and I was trying to understand also like the type of gaslighting, but if I'm understanding correctly, if you're reaching out to, city councils or whoever it might be for a response and they're not responding, that sort of thing, I would say that your most important tool is, the reporting and data that you gather, because it's impossible for them to ignore you when you show up with information, that they can't ignore. And just as one example, when I was working on a piece at Think Progress on the Fairfax County Sheriff's Department referring undocumented immigrants to ICE, I found this little sliver of information in a community report, about the numbers. This was a sheriff talking about the numbers of immigrants that they were turning over to ICE. And when I initially filed a public record request, they, the sheriff's department tried to say that they weren't gathering the numbers. And I said, well, how's that so? Your sheriff herself was saying that these were the numbers for this year. And so they, at that point, knew that they were, that they had to respond. And so that's why I always say like that data is your most important tool in terms of getting your foot in the door so that people cannot try to slam it on you, cannot ignore you, and they have to respond to these issues that you're covering because of the information that you've dug up.
Great. So I'm going to end here, guys. We went a little long, but the discussion was so rich. You've done really impactful work. This is an important topic that touches all of our communities. So I want to thank FIJ and the Uproot Project for hosting this webinar. I want to thank my fantastic panel, Yvette, Yanick, Ese, and Manalo. And I think they may have put their email addresses in the chat if you want to get in touch with them. There are resources in the chat. I hope and I think we may actually send the chat to all attendees. So thank you again for your time. Thank you. panelists for your expertise this afternoon. We started, it was morning, but now it's afternoon. And thank you for all those who attended. Have a good day, everyone.